Okay, so you might notice that one theme of today's lectures, beginning with open economy and then exchange rate, and then now this unemployment lecture, is really just sort of laying down some definitional ideas, not really setting up any kind of new models or really even changing existing models too much. Obviously, we opened the economy up in the previous lectures, but it was more about having a sort of set of jargon and a way to think about sort of what that means in the context of the conversation about purchasing power in respective countries from and about respective countries, and then what that means in terms of trade flows. It's a conversation that you hear very often in the news and the sort of it's a very popular conversation to have when we talk about the economy. It's a very complex conversation, and I think very often, and there's some incentives to do this, but we can sort of lose sight of the relative simple ideas that give rise to these complex ideas and also outcomes. And so a lot of today is just sort of reminding ourselves that, okay, here's some basic ideas we want to lose sight of, and things that we sort of should already be somewhat comfortable with from a principles perspective. And that certainly carries over into the unemployment conversation. It really sort of goes without saying, why are we talking about unemployment? For us, really what we want to sort of have a conversation about is, if we're going to frame, as we do in the neoclassical, and then we'll continue to do so in future models, the idea of output being sort of generated from a potential position, that the economy, and if it is efficient and operating at full capacity, is going to generate a potential amount of GDP. And from that, it's also going to generate a potential amount of employment. Now, to the extent that we think about that level of employment as being the correct level of employment, is to some extent left up for interpretation. Suffice it to say that from the economist's perspective, the idea behind employment is that employment is going to respond to cyclical changes in the economic system. And we are going to tend to think about unemployment as representing sort of three particularly important parts of the macroeconomy. So the first is the sort of frictional nature of labor markets, and that's just the people quitting and moving to new positions. Typically, our assumption is that people are quitting jobs they don't like and trying to get jobs they do like. So we think about that frictional part of the labor market is in fact being a positive. So that level of unemployment we wouldn't refer to or consider to be a cyclical contraction. It is simply the natural, as we think it is, movement of people between jobs. We're not thinking in terms of people being laid off and then going on and finding another job, but rather people quitting their job in pursuit of a job that they would prefer. This, in a sense, can kind of go back to the idea of specialization and comparative advantage. We tend to think that people are always looking for those jobs in which they have the highest comparative advantages. Whether they're looking for it or they're just naturally moving to them is, I think, a very interesting conversation to have. So there's some nice efficiency that we get from that set of assumptions, but then we're still left to sort of grapple with the other types of unemployment that we wouldn't necessarily think are so positive. Then there's the sort of structural nature of our economy and what it's sort of producing in terms of the amount of employment opportunities for individuals. And going back to that production function conversation that we've been having, what is your country producing? In a sense, that means what does your country need in terms of skills? And so the idea here is that you could structurally have unemployment that arises from there being a skill mismatch in your economy. That's not good, right? That means that people in your economy have been trained to do certain things, but your economy doesn't need them to do that. Now, if you believe that the economy is optimally always efficient and always at equilibrium, or at least you think that it generally is, as we think in the classical model, then in a sense, you're not necessarily going to worry about structural unemployment or the structural labor market dysfunction. In a sense, you think that gives rise to a correction. So that there is this structural problem that people, through their own rational self-interest, are going to seek to close that structural gap, if you will, and so therefore the market will correct itself over time. That's a very classical neoclassical argument. Keynes and most economists since then are not going to argue that. They're going to argue, in fact, that structural unemployment is, in a sense, the most persistent and chronic type of unemployment, that in fact, individuals who find themselves at a skill mismatch often are not able at times to get those new skills that would enable them to engage with new technology, so to speak. And so this is where you get the argument in favor of like job training programs and incentivizing trades and incentivizing people to go back to school even if they're adults, so on and so forth. And there's been a lot of policy that we've created since the Great Depression, sort of, that aims at dealing with that structural unemployment. And there's a lot of debates and so on and so forth about what we should actually be doing about it. But it's certainly a problematic source of sort of economic dysfunction. Even if you think the market corrects itself over time, economists don't really think that anymore, but it still sort of represents a problem. The sort of more formative type of unemployment that ends up kind of setting up really the remainder of the course, certainly this movement into the Keynesian revolution, is cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is specifically that unemployment that arises from the cyclical nature of your economy. And so when your economy is doing well, you tend to be adding jobs, and when your economy is not doing well, you tend to be shedding jobs. Cyclical unemployment, to a classical neoclassical economist, is really no different than structural. It's sort of just unemployment. The market is going to correct itself over time, and so you may experience cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment may have been brought to bear because of dysfunction in your economy, but that's still, in a sense, healthy. It's still good for the economy to re-equilibrate on its own from that particular issue. The other way to think about structural, but then specifically cyclical unemployment, is the sort of Keynesian way to think about it, which is that cyclical unemployment is something that we should be very concerned about. That cyclical unemployment can then turn into chronic cyclical unemployment, but also in a way can turn into structural unemployment. You can basically, if the employment situation in your country starts to decline, it can sort of start to turn off parts of your economy. And so you start to have this sort of structural unemployment that you didn't have previously necessarily, right? We saw this, anytime the U.S. economy has been sort of overrepresented by particular industries, whenever you sort of went into recession, you sort of got this immediate, cyclical unemployment that then seemed to feed into longer lasting structural unemployment. And so this is why we create unemployment insurance, and the government starts to step in to do more to help people as they lose their job. That obviously was not something that we did very much historically, in part because there was this sort of classical view of economic systems, but also because we were still figuring out, I think, what the role of the U.S. government was going to be in the context of something like the labor market. And in many ways, of course, we're still figuring out what this was going to mean for just macroeconomics in general. I often think about frictional unemployment as good unemployment. You want frictional unemployment. If you didn't have frictional unemployment, that means people are stuck in their jobs, and that's actually problematic. One sort of interesting economic indicator that modern economists really look at is job quits. Because if you just sort of make an assumption that job quits are happening because people are seeking better employment opportunities, then job quits are really good. You like job quits. You, of course, don't like layoffs. You don't like firings, right? You don't like jobs reducing the number of positions, but quits are really good. You can think about quits as, in a sense, sort of being like the lubrication, in a way, of labor markets. But it will be that cyclical unemployment, really, that ends up being the main focus of us as we move into the sort of Keynesian sort of idea. Now, as we have done, we're going to set up a very simple model of unemployment and just work through it a little bit, again, to give our brain a way to sort of think about it. You will see this idea come up quite a bit later in the semester when we get to the solo growth model. But we will start thinking about sort of economic processes in terms of what we refer to as steady states. Steady states, can be thought of in terms of equilibriums, but they're not really so much equilibriums in the sense that they're more about that there are multiple flows that are producing a particular outcome. And that when that outcome becomes constant, it will be because those flows are equal to each other on both sides. We'll see this later on, again, going back to the solo growth model in the context of capital investment versus capital depreciation. So the idea there will be that businesses invest in capital. This increases the capital stock. And then every year there is some level of depreciation. That depreciation reduces the capital stock. So the steady state's going to be where the investment is equal to the level of depreciation, right? So that's going to be similar here. The steady state in the labor market, the steady state in the unemployment situation is going to be when basically the number of people who are finding new jobs who were previously unemployed is equal to the number of people who are leaving or exiting jobs who were previously employed. And so that's where we get this steady state condition right here. So F times U is the job finding rate times the number of unemployed. So that's the number of people who find jobs in a given time period. We tend to think about this in terms of months very often. And so, hold on one second, just having some issue here. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. I had a couple of those issues today. Anyway, so the reason why this is important for us is because ultimately we're going to think about sort of this idea of there being potential output and then therefore being sort of potential employment. But in terms of unemployment, we're going to think about this in the context of the natural rate of unemployment. So the natural rate of unemployment is going to be the rate of unemployment in which there is no cyclical unemployment, essentially. Okay. So when we say natural unemployment, what are we referring to? So if I go back here, frictional plus structural unemployment equals natural unemployment. That is, in a sense, unemployment we can't do anything about. We don't want to do anything about frictional unemployment, and structural is very hard to do anything about in the short term. And if we're going to frame this in the context of like monetary policy, especially monetary policy, there's nothing really on the monetary policy side that can be done about structural unemployment. Really, that has to be sort of more on the executive sort of congressional side of things, job training programs, so on and so forth. Now, the thing is that at any given point in time, it is possible that the natural rate of unemployment may change. So when we talk about the natural rate of unemployment, one of the interesting conversations is going to be, well, does that rate change over time? When we get into monetarism next week, one of the things that we're going to talk about is the relationship between unemployment and inflation in particular. And basically, the idea is going to be that there's going to be a level of employment or a level of unemployment in your economy that will start to cause inflation. So unemployment falls. As unemployment starts to fall, there's going to be an extent of unemployment that can fall where there's little to maybe only a little bit of inflationary pressure. And then at a certain point, if unemployment continues to fall, it puts serious pressure on inflation to the extent that we don't really want to push the economy that far. This is, of course, a fairly controversial idea, sort of arguing that it's healthy for some fraction of the labor market to remain unemployed. I think I wouldn't necessarily say that it's a good thing. I would say that it is natural. There's nothing that we can do to close that particular gap. And so trying to do that in the short term is virtually impossible. And really, structural unemployment, we probably should try to close over time. But in a sense, there's always going to be new structural unemployment. So in a sense, it's sort of chasing a moving target, if you will. Like I said, we typically think about employment in terms of months. So in this month, how many people got jobs versus how many people left jobs. And then in a month where those two sides of the equation are equal, then we have no net change in the labor market. So the labor market will have found a steady state. The dynamic here is important because our expectation is going to be that the labor market is always moving towards the steady state. That there's the mechanism that we rely upon, the mathematical formulation, implies that there's always going to be a movement towards the steady state. So if you are not in the steady state currently, if your labor market's not in quote unquote the steady state, it's going to be moving towards it. So the idea here would be that, let's say for this month, you had a lot more people find jobs than people who left their job. So you had a net job gain. The idea is that as the economy moves to the steady state, that net job gain is going to decline. So the next month, you may still have job gain, but the amount of job gain is going to be less than it was previously. And then subsequently all the way until you get net zero job gain, and then you will have reached the steady state. So the idea is that the economic system is always moving towards the steady state. So if you have if you're increasing the jobs, that means that your unemployment rate is falling. So it's moving from a higher level down to a lower level. And if you have an increase in unemployment, it moves in the opposite direction. And so you can sort of start to have a story, an idea of what this means in terms of this sort of steady state idea. Okay, UL here. So this is the unemployment rate. So we'll call this unemployment rate, which is just the level of unemployed divided by the labor force. So the important thing that a lot of the general population gets wrong about unemployment is that we only consider you to be unemployed if you are in the labor force, but you don't currently have a job. The way that we define in the labor force in the U.S. context by the Bureau of Labor Statistics is 16 or older, willing and able to work full or part-time. And so here, the people that would be unemployed would be people who, hold on one second, someone has rung my doorbell.